10 or 12 years is about how long I'd keep a high-end power supply. I mean, they're good for a very long time. It's just, here's the thing on power supplies. I will keep a power supply for a very long time for the computer that it's in, only considering maintenance and or recapping a replacement when it becomes classic or retro. But what I wouldn't do is take a 10 or 12-year-old power supply and move it to a new $2,000 or $3,000 high-end build.
Why would you do that?
I wouldn't. But
I know you wouldn't, but why would they do that?
because they don't realize that the capacitors and the power supply output dies down over time and the voltage regulation isn't quite as good. The other thing to consider is I think a lot of people think, okay, I'll use my hardware stock for a couple years until I've gotten my value out of it, then I'll overclock it to the max to try to get a few more years out of it. So you're taking a system that is now aged with a motherboard that's aged and a power supply that's aged, and now you're going to max it out?
Don't do that.
That's kind of the reverse. What I would do is once the machine is several years old, that's when you take the overclock out. So there's actually interesting topics looking at some retro channels, LGR,
8-bit guy.
8-bit guy, and some others where they take some older computers, and one of the things that they sometimes do is take the power supplies out and change the capacitors because they either leak or have the chemicals have reacted. If you ever see a capacitor that's expanded or the top is rounded, you want to replace that. You don't want to leave it. And of course, capacitors are capacitors. You could replace those with modern capacitors.
Yep.
Either you can just develop some basic soldering skills, which is basically just two wires. But if that's too hard, or you're scared to open them, which is a fair concern, you want to know what you're doing. It's not something to be done with no thinking. But there's plenty of tutorials and how-to guides to do that on YouTube if you're so inclined. Or you can pay somebody. There's services that will basically go through a power supply and they'll test all the parts. You'll pay more than the power supply cost to begin with to do this. But if you've got the power supply to, say, an Amiga 500, those aren't new on the you can't order those from Newegg, so recapping an old one is the only way to do it. And it would really suck to have a working 20 or 30-year-old machine and have a bad power supply fry it.
Yeah. Just a little bit.
On the other hand, when LGR opened up his IBM AT, which was 32 years old, 31 years old, never been opened out of the box. Not only did everything work perfectly, but even the lithium real-time clock battery that kept track of the time, it was still working perfectly and still keeping track of the time perfectly. It had been sealed in a box in a warehouse for over 30 years.
Yep.
And it was, but I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. It was built like a tank. It was built by people who cared and knew what they were doing. It was built with premium steel components, and it was not made in China.
Oh.
I'm so bad. They actually built those in Scotland, of all places.
Scotland. Scottish with the haggis.
They actually
and their scotch.
You used to be able to buy computers that say made in
Scotland. Scotch tape.
Or somewhere made in Ireland, somewhere made in Scotland.
Huh.
Not China, not Taiwan.
Home of the brave.
30 years later, fresh out of the box, they still work perfectly. They do. They were built like trucks. Of course, they cost $5,000, which in today's money is like $10,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why it's not made in Scotland anymore.
There you go.